New Thought Media Network is proud to present New Thought's Roots and Branches with Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller. Join us every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Tune in live or watch anytime on our YouTube channel. Discover the rich history of New Thought and its impact on modern spirituality. Join Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller as she shares insights, stories, and teachings that inspire and uplift. Experience deep insights and transformative teachings that connect you to the roots of New Thought. Visit our YouTube channel to catch up on past episodes and join us live every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Connect with us and be part of the journey.
Hi, I am Ruth Miller, and this is New Thought Roots and Branches. And it's a delight to be here with you as we explore what's going on, how we got here, and where we may be going in the New Thought world. Today, we're going to be talking about the founders of Unity, Myrtle and Charles Fillmore, a couple that was an amazing story and did incredible things for all of us in the world. And they were part of a long tradition. In the next slide, we can see this complex tradition that goes way back thousands of years, people coming to understand and share their ideas and demonstrate possibilities. And there, down near the bottom of that long web of people, is Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, and then all the people who are connected with them. In our next slide, we can see a little more of the modern teachers. We see that Charles and Myrtle are that young man and woman there near the top in the middle, and all these other people who have learned from them or been their colleagues over the last 100 years, actually 140 years. If we go to the next slide, we can see how most people experience Charles and Myrtle. For decades, they were this marvelous older couple with a sparkle and a sense of love and a willingness to explore and be incredibly supportive. And in the process, they created something amazing. So in the next slide, we find that, first of all, they healed their own selves. They healed their bodies, and we'll talk about what they did and how. And then, as people saw what was going on for them, they supported individuals and groups developing their own capacity to heal their own selves and other people through that same prayerful process. They went on to publish the experiences, the examples, the principles, the processes, so that people all over the world could learn how to have these kinds of experiences, and created the School of Practical Christianity. Unity School of Practical Christianity. They taught thousands of people, usually in groups of a few dozen to a few hundred, and went on for about 40 years as teachers together. They expanded into Unity Ministries from the school. Now, this is something that seems to happen to all New Thought people. We start a school, people want to learn, people discover possibilities, they learn the techniques, and then they realize, oh no, I really want to go to church, but I can't go to the other kind of church because it doesn't support these teachings. And so the school becomes a church, and then the church becomes the entity, and that seems to be the essence of the New Thought experience. But as we go on, we find that the church and the school together grew and grew, so that at one point there were about 1 million people around the world in Unity, in this marvelous network, an international network of learning centers, study centers, and churches. So today we're going to learn a little more about Myrtle and about Charles. The next slide introduces us to Myrtle. Myrtle, as you can see, was not born Myrtle. She was born Mary Catherine, or Mary Carolyn Page. I always want to say Catherine, but it's Carolyn. Mary Carolyn Page. And that was a family, the family that established Pagetown, Ohio, where she was born in 1845. She was the youngest of 5 children. And from very early on, her father called her my little Myrtle. And I have not yet learned why. I have some ideas, but I have not learned why. So I'm looking forward, if someone else knows, to finding out. As she got into her teen years, along about 16, 17 years old, she had mastered everything available in the local school and went off to Oberlin College and went through the 2-year teaching program. The normal school program is what it was called, and got her credential. She started teaching. And all of this was happening while she was suffering from what she was told was inherited tuberculosis. Now, we know today that's not how it happens, that TB is a form of bacteria, and it's the tubercle bacillus is what TB stands for. And the issue is not something you can inherit, but she did try everything available. Her parents were well enough off, and she was a teacher earning her own money, and the doctors were not able to help her. So when her brother moved to Iowa from Ohio, she went with him. She began teaching there, and she was a very powerful and beloved teacher. Her students loved Miss Page. Yes, indeed. She was able to help them see things and to learn in this joyful way that they really, really, really appreciated. But every few years, she'd have to go someplace else. As anyone who's ever lived in the Missouri Valley knows, it's not a place to live if you've got respiratory issues. It's a little hard on the body. So she would head off to somewhere else, and often to the town of Denison in Texas, which was much drier and the climate was much less extreme. And she would stay there until she was strong again and then go back to her teaching in Iowa. In the next slide, we learn about Charles. Charles was born in upstate New York to a fur trapper, Charles Sherlock Fillmore, in 1854, which you will note is 9 years after Myrtle was born. So he was considerably younger, although he was the elder of 2 brothers, so he knew how to be the eldest in the group. And when his father kind of ran out of furs in the New York area, he moved the family to Minnesota. Most of the furs that he was going for were actually in Canada, but northern Minnesota was pretty rich at that time. So they moved to St. Cloud, the area that is now St. Cloud, as Charles was turning 2 and the younger brother was born. Shortly, he lived the normal life, except for one incident we'll talk about shortly, but the accident that he had at 10, he fell through the ice rescuing someone, and it really damaged his leg. Unfortunately, that was not healing easily. And he spent the next 2 years going through some pretty awful processes trying to heal this leg. And it resulted in its being quite a bit shorter. Some people say as much as 6 inches shorter than his other leg, and covered in scar tissue. And every doctor that came along would offer some treatment and say, I don't know how you survive what that quack did to you, the previous guy that was there. So that went on over and over again until finally he was strong enough to get up and get around. And about that time, his father didn't come home from a fur trapping trip. So he went to work rather than going back to school. He'd already lost 2 years of school, and he began to work in the local print shop and supported his mother and younger brother that way. A woman came into the shop who had a son of her own, and she wanted her son to make it into military academy. So she invited Charles, who was clearly a bright young man, to come sit with her son and provide a little bit of competition, maybe, and a little bit of partnership in learning. Well, it turns out she was a graduate of Oberlin College. Now, Oberlin was unique at that time. Well, it still is quite unique. It's a marvelous school. But at that time, it was almost completely focused on the teachings of the Transcendentalists. And if you listen to me talking about Ralph Waldo Emerson, you know some of those teachings. But that also included Alcott, Louisa May's father, Bronson Alcott. It included Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, and dozens of other folks that somehow brought that transcendental idea into Ohio and Oberlin. Well, Charles put in his apprenticeship in the print shop. When his younger brother was old enough to leave home, he could leave his mom, and he went and got on a railroad train and started working for the railway, ended up as a clerk, and then as the manager at the station in Denison, Texas. So let's look at the next slide. It's going to be about Charles first, and then into meeting Myrtle in Denison. When they first got to St. Cloud, a very strange thing happened. And that is, the mother looked up one day, his mom looked up one day, and there were a group of Native Americans on horseback in full regalia, all men, lots of feathers, lots of beads. And she is going, oh, what's going to happen to us, right? Well, one of them spoke enough English that she was able to understand that their elders had realized that a great spiritual leader was at this location. Literally, he pinpointed the location in the area where this great spiritual leader was. There was only Charles at 2. And with great trepidation, his mom let him go with this group of Indians, Native Americans, she called them Indians, and spend 24 hours with them as their guest, their honored guest. And over the years that Charles was living in that area, until he was almost 20, he would periodically go back to the Ojibwe village, and he spoke with them and learned from them, and then forgot all about it as he went about his life. In later years, once Unity Village was built, a group of Ojibwe grandchildren of those who first came to see him came to visit because they saw the fulfillment of what those grandparents had experienced and expected. All right, so back to Charles at 20. It's 1874. He's in Denison, Texas. Next slide. We get to see this young man and this beautiful young woman. And he's in Denison. And you know, when you don't have TV or radio, and there aren't a whole lot of people invent what they're going to entertain themselves with. And one of the things that happened in Denison was regular readings of poetry. And he walked into a room one evening, and there was this, she was a redhead, wonderful, beautiful woman. And the voice in his head said, Charles, there's your wife. Well, she wasn't quite sure what to make of this young man with this serious limp and lift in his leg, but he admired her poetry, and he started quoting Ralph Waldo Emerson. They were both effectively Oberlin grads, very interested in transcendentalism, and that began a long series of conversations, long walks, her with her lungs and him with his foot, so I have no idea how those walks worked, and letters after she went back to Iowa. And he realized, okay, I'm going to marry this woman. There is no way I can do that as a clerk or even as a station manager in Denison, Texas. So he took off for Gunnison, Colorado, and became first a mule team driver. Now, one of the stories of him as a mule team driver is, if any of you have ever been on the $1 Million Highway in Colorado, you know what that road is like, the switchbacks and the steep angles. Well, he was riding that on a mule cart, loaded with either supplies going one direction or silver coming the other direction. Well, it happened one time coming downhill, the mules weren't able to make a turn, and that cart full of everything went over the side, and Charles was able to extricate himself and get back on the path, and he limped back into town and said, I think I'm done doing this job. So because he had the capacity to read and write and do figures, he went into the assayer's office and very quickly became a partner, very quickly earned enough to be able to build a home. And at that point, he wrote a letter to Iowa and said, Miss Myrtle, would you please marry me? And she wrote back, yes. So they were married, next slide, in Clinton, Missouri. And they were you can see it was a long courtship, 1881. And they planned to live in Gunnison. They took they got on the train in Missouri, and they went all the way across to where they had to get on a coach. They went on the coach for as far as they could. Then they got on the buckboard and went all the way into town. Whoops, the town was bust. So then they ended up going back to the nearest city, which was Pueblo, Colorado. And Charles, there's marvelous stories there. I won't go into them, but basically he was able to manifest enough money to support them in a rooming house and pay for an office and start a real estate business with virtually nothing to begin with. So they did, and they lived there for several years. They had 2 sons, Lowell, who later took over the Unity movement, and we'll talk about that, and Waldo Rickett, who is the builder of the Unity Village. And Charles' mother moved in to help take care of the family. And basically, Charles' mother was the homemaker for them the rest of their lives, the rest of her lives. After a few years in Pueblo, it went bust. And the nearest active city was Kansas City, and that was going to be close to her brother. So they moved to Kansas City, the whole household, and then formed a new real estate company. And Charles was very, very successful. There are streets in Kansas City now that he laid out, and there are buildings that he arranged for building, and so on. So it was quite the work in Kansas City. And they had another son. But in the meantime, Myrtle's health is just failing rapidly. As we look at the next slide, we see that there is the need to do something. Literally, the doctors were saying it was a matter of weeks. Now, she's the mother of very young sons, a couple of them. The oldest, I think, was approaching preteen years at this point, 1885, 1886. And so they started looking for other means. If the doctors were never going to help her, they started attending occult groups and spiritualist groups. They attended Christian Science meetings and so on. And this man called E.B. Weeks came into Kansas City and offered a lecture. And it was an overview of Emma Hopkins' 12 lessons. And during that overview, Myrtle heard a phrase that has become a key phrase in the Unity history. I am a child of God, therefore I do not inherit illness. Whoa, that completely contradicted everything she'd been told her whole life. And she realized that there was a whole different interpretation of what the biblical norms of the time, lots of hell and damnation in those days. And so she went into the Bible and started marking all the passages that were loving and healing and supporting, and used all of her waking hours studying and filling her mind with, as Emma Hopkins would recommend, all of the goodness of God. It was a matter of weeks before people saw the incredible difference in her well-being. And they did what people usually do and said, I want more of what you got. And the next slide, we see that Charles is watching all of this, and he's trying to understand what's going on. And so he sets aside a year, and every day for a year, he spends at least half an hour to an hour reading spiritual material, trying to understand what was going on. And at the end of the year, he said it was a mess of contradictions. So he was going to go to headquarters. So he would sit every day for 30 minutes listening. He would sit there expecting the next words, just as you were just then. And he heard absolutely nothing at the end of the year, nothing. However, his leg was less scarred than it had been before. His business was doing better than it was before. The tensions and unhappiness at home were almost completely gone. And in his dreams, he was getting guidance for what to do next in life. Oh my goodness, there was something working here. So in the next slide, we see that he decided to join Myrtle and help folks begin to understand and read and pray together. So Myrtle, being a teacher, of course, was happy to do this for anyone who wanted to come by. And I'm sure she was absolutely delighted when her husband finally became one of those folks, right? And they started getting letters from all kinds of people. She was getting them initially. And then when he was part of the group, other people started writing to him as well. Dozens of letters. So they ended up forming what they called the Society of Silent Help. And they met every evening and began to write answers to these letters. Well, you may recall that Charles had apprenticed to a printer. So in the next slide, we find that he got hold of a printing press and began to publish things. He printed a little newsletter in which those letters and people's responses and their experiences were published, and people would, buy it. They didn't buy it, but sometimes they'd give them a donation. He would share this however he could with anyone. And then the next year, they turned that little newsletter into a magazine. He had increased the kind of equipment that he had and was able to actually publish something and bind it together. And the next year, well, there was this woman in New York, and Myrtle got a hold of one of her brochures, her little pamphlets, and Myrtle handed it to Charles and said, I think you need to let this woman write some articles. And so he asked this woman, who was H. Emily Cady, and we'll talk more about her next time. That's our next session. It was her lessons. She wrote 12 lessons, one in each edition of the magazine. And what was really interesting is that people kept requesting more copies of that edition. So lesson 1, they'd suddenly have to reprint the magazine over and over again, 2, 3. And after this went on for a few months, Charles got a bright idea, and he published a little booklet that was the 3 lessons. So he didn't have to republish the whole magazine. And so the booklets began to be how he let people experience what it was that Emily Cady was saying in the magazine and then in these pamphlets. And we'll talk about what she said next time. Then, a year or two later, we've gone through the 12 lessons. Now we have a bunch of material, and we have all the answers and all the letters that people have written. And so they started putting together the Daily Word in 1893. And it just had anniversary year in 2023. And this includes 1 or 2 articles, but the most important thing is day by day, Sunday, April 20th, Monday, April 21, there would be a word, a keyword, a statement supporting that keyword, a little bit of text, 2 or 3 paragraphs of how one could relate to the statement, and then a quote from the Bible. This little pamphlet, this little booklet, 30 pages every month, 35 at most, would go out. I'm sorry, it had to be 36 because folios are by 8. So 36 at most. It started showing up everywhere. And those of you who are of an age or have seen on YouTube, a Catholic Archbishop Sheen, who was later Cardinal Sheen, was one of the subscribers to the Daily Word. And many bishops and many priests in the high churches subscribed to Daily Word as well. And just to bring it into modern times, some Unity folks were visiting with the Dalai Lama. They showed him the Daily Word. He skimmed through it and he said, just change the word God to good. This is perfect. So the next thing that happened that same year as putting out the Daily Word, which was every month, Myrtle was able to take her stuff that she had taught as an elementary school teacher and the things she had learned in this prayer work and combine them. And she published a little magazine every month called We Wisdom. And you may even know someone, if they were a child in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they may have actually been recipients of We Wisdom. It lasted, would you believe, in print until 1991. Just amazing. We Wisdom. So making a difference in their publications. In the next picture, you see a proud Charles standing in front of the sign because he had rented this building and made all of this happen. And there is the sign, the Unity Tract Society and the Society of Silent Unity. The story of how Unity became the name is kind of cool. They had meditation groups as well as classes. And in one of these meditation groups, Charles had been really uncomfortable with modern thought, and he couldn't use the word Christian Science because Mary Baker Eddy was saying no. And it just wasn't working. But he had read all of this material from all of these religious traditions and all these spiritual traditions, and he knew he was at the core of them. And suddenly in the middle of the meditation, he jumps up and he says, "Unity, I've got it, unity." You can imagine what the rest of the group felt like, yes? But that's the kind of enthusiasm he brought. When he was in his 90s, one of the favorite quotes that people like to use is, "I fairly sizzle with zeal and enthusiasm." As we go forward, we see that, oh my goodness, they discovered that E.B. Weeks was a student of Emma Curtis Hopkins. So in the next slide, as they were beginning the publishing, they invited Emma Curtis Hopkins to come to Kansas City, and she did her basic course there. Charles promoted the event, calling her one of the greatest teachers in the world. There were over 250 plus or minus attending at each of the events of the series. And that series was based, for those of you who paid attention in our last session, on her book, The Class Lessons of 1888. And many people would take home copies of that. And then the next year, Emma invited them to Chicago to stay in her home. You may recall that she did invite people to do that, and to complete the advanced course. And that course is based on a book called Esoteric Philosophy, which is available through Wise Women Press, but it's also available in my translation of it as The Spiritual Science of Emma Curtis Hopkins through Simon & Schuster. That is the advanced course. That is when you get all of those 12 lessons we went over last time. The only thing that exists is God, and God is omnipotent good, the only power, the only presence. And you realize there are old ideas to let go of, and you let go of them, and then you replace them with ideas of how life really is. And then you claim, based on that knowing, what you intend to experience for yourself and other people in the world. That was the basic course. And the advance took them even deeper. The process was something that they took very much to heart. And they were invited by Emma to come back during the Chicago World's Fair, and they graduated from the program. And then they were invited back to be ordained by Emma Curtis Hopkins in that second version of her seminary. And on the way home from that, they wrote a letter, and I've seen a photograph that has since been copied of that letter. It was a handwritten letter, and they pledged to never do anything for the money. From that point on, everything they did was based on love offerings only. They never charged a thing until the post office required that they charge for the Daily Word, because there was a post office regulation that said they couldn't send out that number of things for free. They had to charge. So the Daily Word had to charge. But everything else for Unity, for starting from that moment, was love offerings based. There were some lean times, but there was a lot of wealth. Let's look at the next picture. The next slide there's Myrtle, sweet young Myrtle, and her husband looking much older than her, even though he's 9 years younger. His mother in there, who basically raised the three sons behind them. Lowell is, Lowell Page, he was named in the family. And Lowell was there to ultimately take over from Charles when the time came. Waldo Rickard, Waldo Emerson, right? Rickard was a family name. It was a cousin. And he was the man who designed all of Unity Village. He had gone to World War I as a soldier. Lowell was too old, and their younger brother was too young. And so Rickard went off into the army and was stationed in Italy and fell in love with Italian architecture. So we'll talk more about exactly how that worked. But that's the Fillmore family there at the time that they're producing all this good stuff. In the next slide, we get how the school evolved into the ministry. It encouraged the unity of all denominations. It encouraged the unity of science and religion, of God and humanity, and of all people with one another. This is marvelous, but it's hard to find in any traditional church setting, on any religious setting, actually, because religions tend to define themselves as unique, not part of a larger unity. And then there was silent unity, which was that system of meeting the requests for prayer that were pouring in. At one point, there were 150 people. Well, actually, now there are 150 people working 24/7, 365. And at that, spreading it out. Okay, not everybody all the time, but spreading it out among the shifts. And that was huge, that silent unity. And people would often send love offerings with their testimonials of how things had worked. And they typed letters. Myrtle hand wrote thousands of letters in response to these requests. And then they do the publications, and they've set up retreats. One of the things that they loved to do was to go back to Colorado and spend 3 weeks on a mountainside. And they would take however many of their students wished to join them. They had ongoing classes, constantly offering classes, and then they began to do Sunday services. Our next slide shows Myrtle at her desk as she is writing letters. I've actually had the opportunity to sit in that room at that desk, and I have to tell you, it just feels like love embodied. It is just such a marvelous place to be. Let's look at some of the things that she reflected on in the next slide. People were asking, how did you do all of this? And she says, well, we just received from the Father some ideas that proved wonderfully helpful in our own family. And then we shared them with others, and they too were helped. And since those of like faith and are drawn together, we soon found ourselves in a little society, the Society of Silent Prayer, right? Which was formed for the study of truth and the practice of its ideas, and we grew. After a time, it seemed that the other folks went their various ways, and only we were left to continue to do what we felt was important enough to develop and to devote ourselves to. And Unity School unfolded and continued to grow. And isn't that how it often happens? There's this initial budding, and it's wonderful, and everyone gets very excited about it, but then life takes them to other things. But the core of that bud, in this case, Charles and Myrtle, were willing to continue. And they did, and it grew. In our next slide, we can see in their later years in the classrooms. This is a classroom in Kansas City, and you can see the kind of a mixed age group of folks. That's a very small part of the class. And they're up there answering questions and encouraging study. The next slide talks a little bit about that room and where it was and what all they did. They built a headquarters in Kansas City. It was a 3-story building. It had the printing press in the basement with all the distribution stuff. It had a cafeteria in classrooms on the main floor, and a floor that was totally opened up to be a major meeting hall. At the time they were building this, they had 1,000 people subscribing to the magazine and the Daily Word, and they had 500 employees in the building. They also had a farm outside of town in the town called Lee Summit, which is where the village grew. At that time, they farmed and grew all of the food that was served in the cafeteria. It was all vegetarian, and they also grew and made available to local neighbors and anyone who was willing to go on out there all kinds of food, cider and milk, but also all kinds of vegetables and grains. And they kept on going through the Depression, providing this. I'm going to give you in the next slide some images of this remarkable building that they built. And there is evidence of that still in Kansas City. You can get a bigger sense of it in the next slide. In the next picture, we were just looking at the little bit in the corner in the back there in the left corner. And this is actually what the whole building ended up looking like. They had an apartment in the building, and that's where they lived and worked. You can see there's a chimney. They had an incinerator, and they were pretty much a closed system with the farm. So they were fully supplied with everything they needed to operate. And the other piece is the incinerator was a boiler system, so that was all heated with a boiler. So they had their heat, they had their food, and they had thousands of people in their home building every day. Next picture, we get to see the actual lunchroom and the facility, the part of the building the lunchroom was in. Initially, they offered their food for free. They'd done that at home whenever people were there working, and then people wouldn't eat. Someone told them they had to charge something for people to be willing to eat. So they charged 50 cents for a meal. The bars down the street charged $1 for lunch. So, hey, this was a good deal. And you got seconds, right? Vegetarian meals grown with love, served with love by people who are practicing what Charles and Myrtle called practical Christianity. The next slide shows the farm stand where things were made available for people year round. And that farm stand, I just found out a few months ago, has been reinstated and is now operating again. There's still some apples in the orchard, and they're still providing other goodies that are being grown on the land, although the bulk of the land is now a golf course. Oh, well. I'm going to give you in the next slide the process of building. Is that amazing? Those are students and volunteers building the buildings that are core to Unity Village. That tall thing in the background, well, that's their water tower, but it's going to look like an Italian clock tower because Rickard loved Italian architecture. And all those arches are very much present at Unity Village today. And Rickard involved a lot of interesting new techniques. He was one of the first people in the world to use prefab concrete for various parts of the building. And he involved recessed lighting, and there's a lot of mosaic in the buildings. There are beautiful, beautiful paintings on walls. It's just an amazing, amazing experience. If you can get to Unity Village, Lee Summit, outside of Kansas City, and they have a brand new airport at Kansas City because the Chiefs made it into the Super Bowl. It's just an amazing experience. All right. Next slide shows us Charles and Myrtle teaching on Sundays. They curtained off one of the areas at the back of one of the rooms in the new buildings, and they had their bishop's chairs. You can see Myrtle sitting in one and part of one behind Charles there. And he's up there speaking. And most of the books that are Charles's books are, in fact, his sermons that their secretary, Cora Dedrick, put together into books and then had published in the Unity presses. Next slide. The two of them leading a prayer service that wasn't all verbal, folks. They really got into the presence of the Holy Spirit. You might have thought you were walking into a Holy Roller Pentecostal service when they were in their prayer service. But the idea was to get to the place where you could feel that power and that presence and know it was working in you and through you, with you, and with everyone in the room. It was a powerful place indeed. And they still found time to do some writing. And in the next slide, we get to see the compilation of some of the thousands of letters that Myrtle wrote in the book Myrtle Fillmore's Healing Letters. And then, well, Charles found that if he looked at the Bible in a totally different way, it was much more meaningful. And he put together the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary. And if you've been in Unity, you're familiar with this. It's quite thick. You could put it next to your Bible and they would feel, and then a Strong's Concordance next to it, and the three of them would fit really well together. He took the Hebrew words in the Old and New Testament, gave the actual definition, and then explained what they meant metaphorically for our life's journey. He believed that we could read the Bible as a metaphor for our own life's journey, including the Gospels, that Jesus' journey was our journey, if we allowed it to be, that Noah's journey was our journey, Job's journey was our journey. And he would talk about how different names, that the direct literal translation, God with us, or in the name of actual Jesus' Hebrew name, which would have been Joshua. Joshua means salvation of God. Well, there were a lot of Joshuas in Hebrew history, right? Jehoshaphat is God's presence as a gift, and so on. So he would talk about that. But he'd also say things like, when it says that they went to a higher ground or they went to the mountains, they're saying they're going up into a higher level of consciousness. So using the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary alongside a Bible reading can be very powerful indeed. The other books there were actually put together by Cora. And Cora was, as I say, their secretary for years. Next image is Charles at the radio station. Charles first started doing programs and then bought through Unity. These are guys who never do anything for the money, but they bought the local radio station. And whenever he couldn't sleep, he'd just be up there broadcasting. So he spent hours on the microphone and invited other people, many of their students, sometimes his sons, many other people in the Unity movement would be on the air at this radio station. But there he is getting ready for the next show. So what are the essentials? The essentials were put together in the next slide by one of their granddaughters in response to a request when she was being invited to be a keynote speaker. And this is her summary of her grandparents' tradition as they were presenting it. And the fundamental is God is everywhere. It's the source of all. And there's a lot more you can play with that. God's nurturing presence is everywhere. God's power is everywhere. Omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent. But then the second principle was almost heretical because it was saying God is in all of us, therefore we're all inherently good. The third principle was also heretical, but it was following what Jesus taught. Our thoughts and feelings, our beliefs as we experience them, create our larger experience. And actually, what we believe deep down inside and may not even know we believe is likely to be creating our experience more than what we think we believe. And a large part of our work in New Thought is to replace that extra old belief and with a new one. This is what lesson 2 in Emma is about. The fourth principle, when we go into prayer and meditation, when we're in that place of being in communion with the source of our being, we strengthen that and we strengthen our awareness of the continuous presence. And finally, we have to live this. We can't just talk about it or study it. The next slide shows Charles and Myrtle in their last few months on the planet. And the final slide here, Myrtle decided one day she was done. And so on a Wednesday, she went around the offices in Kansas City and she checked in with everyone, made sure they were fine. And basically, she didn't say goodbye, but people began to realize that was what's going on. On Friday, she went out to the farm. She harvested some apples. She went to her house. She crawled into bed. And on Tuesday, she was done. She had left her body. In a way, this is Mahasamadhi, for those of you who know that language. Charles went on for a number of years, and it happens that the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, I believe, was how he worked out his grief. In 1932, he's doing all of that work. It gets published in 1933 when he then marries their secretary, Cora Dedrick, and she then encourages a whole new life for him. He turns things over to Lowell, Unity Village, the Unity School, the Unity churches, the ministry, everything is now in his son's hands, and she takes him out to California. And in the meantime, people are going, how old are you, Charles? And in his 90s, he looked younger than he had at 70. And you could see some of that in those photos, can't you? he was getting younger, and his leg was lengthened. By the time he started all of this in his 50s. By the time he was in his 70s, his leg was very nearly the same length as his other leg. And by the time he was in his 90s, there was no scar tissue. Someone was traveling with him on a train. So that's the kind of thing they were doing for themselves. They got over tuberculosis and then on to no issues with the leg. In the next picture, you can see Myrtle there in the arbors before she passed on. That's probably within a day or two of her passing. And then Charles speaking at the Sunday following her passing. And there we have it. Myrtle and Charles Fillmore, the creators and founders of Unity, a worldwide movement that is stationed and headquartered in Unity Village today and is offering many wonderful services to thousands of people everywhere. Thanks for joining me today on New Thought, Roots and Branches. We'll talk more next time.